The blizzard had been howling across the Texas plains for 3 days straight, turning the world into a white hell that swallowed everything beyond arm's reach. Ezra McKenna pulled his worn coat tighter as he stepped out of his cabin, the wind cutting through him like a blade. His breath formed ice crystals that clung to his graying beard, and his weathered hands ached as he gripped the rope that led to his barn. Silent, they called him in the nearby town of Cedar Ridge, though not to his face. Ezra had earned the nickname through years of saying only what needed saying, preferring the company of his cattle and horses to the chatter of men. At 52, he'd lived on this remote ranch for nearly 2 decades, carving out a hard existence on land that seemed determined to kill anything that tried to tame it. The cattle were huddled together in the barn, their breath creating a fog that hung in the frigid air. Ezra forked hay into their feeding troughs, his movements efficient despite the numbing cold. He'd lost 3 head already to this storm, found them frozen solid against the fence line where they'd sought shelter that never came. As he worked, a sound cut through the howling wind, something that didn't belong to the storm's fury. Ezra stopped, his scarred hands gripping the pitchfork as he strained to listen. There it was again, faint but unmistakable, the cry of something alive and in distress. He followed the sound out into the storm, the wind nearly knocking him down as he fought his way toward the source. The crying grew stronger, more desperate, coming from somewhere near the old oak tree that marked the eastern boundary of his property. Ezra's heart hammered as he realized what he might find. Wolves had been spotted in the area, and the storm would drive them to desperation. But as he rounded the massive trunk of the oak, his blood ran cold. There, partially buried in a drift of snow, was a small bundle wrapped in what looked like buffalo hide. The crying was coming from within. Ezra dropped to his knees, his numb fingers working frantically to clear away the snow. The bundle was small, too small, and as he lifted it, he felt the terrible lightness of it. Inside the hide wrapping was an infant, its dark skin blue with cold, its tiny fists waving weakly as it cried. A Comanche baby. Even in the storm's fury, Ezra could see the distinctive beadwork on the hide, the way the infant's hair was already growing thick and black. His mind raced. How had it gotten here? Where were its people? The baby's cries were growing weaker, and Ezra knew he had minutes, maybe less, before the cold claimed the child completely. He tucked the bundle inside his coat, feeling the infant's fragile body against his chest as he fought his way back to the cabin through the blinding snow. Inside, he stoked the fire until it roared, then carefully unwrapped the baby near the hearth. It was a boy, perhaps 3 or 4 months old, his tiny body trembling with cold. Ezra had delivered calves in winter storms, had saved countless animals from freezing, but this was different. This was a human child, and everything about the situation screamed danger. The Comanche had been raiding settlements all along the frontier for months. Just last week, they'd hit the Morrison place, 20 miles south, burning the house and running off the livestock. The territorial government had put a bounty on Comanche scalps, and tensions were higher than they'd been since the end of the war. And here he was, warming a Comanche infant by his fire. Ezra heated milk from his one remaining cow, testing the temperature on his wrist the way he'd seen women do in town. The baby drank greedily, its color slowly returning to normal as warmth seeped back into its small body. As he fed the child, Ezra studied its face, seeing something that made his chest tighten. The infant's eyes were bright and alert, full of intelligence and, somehow, trust. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. The baby blinked up at him, one tiny fist wrapping around Ezra's calloused finger with surprising strength. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside the cabin, something had changed. Ezra McKenna, the silent cowboy who'd chosen isolation over the complications of human connection, found himself responsible for the most vulnerable life he'd ever encountered. As he settled into his chair by the fire, the baby sleeping fitfully in his arms, he wondered if he'd just saved a life or signed his own death warrant. The wind howled around the cabin like a living thing, and in its voice, Ezra could almost hear the sound of war drums in the distance. The storm broke on the 4th day, leaving behind a world transformed into crystalline white silence. Ezra stood at his cabin window, the Comanche baby sleeping in a makeshift crib he'd fashioned from a wooden crate and old blankets. The child had survived the night, and the night before that, growing stronger with each feeding. Ezra had named him Little Wolf in his mind, though he'd never spoken the name aloud. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the morning quiet. Ezra's hand instinctively moved to his rifle as he peered through the frost-covered glass. 3 riders were making their way up the path to his cabin, their horses struggling through the knee-deep snow. He recognized them immediately. Sheriff Tom Brennan, Deputy Jake Morrison, and old Pete Crawford from the general store in Cedar Ridge. "Ezra!" Sheriff Brennan called out as they approached. "You alive in there?" Ezra glanced at the baby, who was beginning to stir. He quickly moved the crate behind his bed, out of sight from the door, then stepped outside to meet the men. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but he forced himself to appear calm. "Sheriff," he nodded, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Hell of a storm." "That it was," Brennan replied, dismounting from his horse. He was a lean man with kind eyes, but Ezra could see the tension in his shoulders. "We've been checking on folks, making sure everyone made it through. Lost the Hendricks family, their roof caved in from the snow load." "Sorry to hear it," Ezra said, though his attention was divided. He could hear faint sounds from inside the cabin. The baby was waking up, and soon he'd be crying for food. Deputy Morrison, a younger man with a quick temper and quicker gun, was studying the ground around the cabin. "Lot of tracks here, Ezra. Some of them look fresh." "Been checking on the cattle," Ezra replied evenly. "Lost a few head to the cold." Pete Crawford, whose store served as the unofficial gossip center of Cedar Ridge, was eyeing him with curiosity. "You look tired, Ezra. Storm keeping you up?" Before Ezra could answer, a thin wail echoed from inside the cabin. All 3 men froze, their eyes fixed on the door. The baby's cry grew louder, more insistent. "What in the hell?" Morrison started, his hand moving toward his gun. "It's nothing," Ezra said quickly, but the damage was done. The crying continued, unmistakably that of an infant. Sheriff Brennan's expression had hardened. "Ezra, whose baby is that?" The moment stretched like a taut wire. Ezra could lie, could claim he'd taken in a settler's child orphaned by the storm. But these men knew him, knew he had no family, no connections to anyone who might leave a child in his care. "Found him during the storm," Ezra said finally. "Nearly froze to death." "Him?" Morrison's voice was sharp. "What do you mean, him?" The baby's cries were growing more frantic now, and Ezra knew he had no choice. He turned and went back into the cabin, the 3 men following. They stopped dead when they saw the makeshift crib, when they saw the dark skin and black hair of the infant within. "Jesus Christ," Pete whispered. "That's a Comanche baby." Morrison's gun was in his hand before Ezra could blink. "You brought a Comanche into your home? Are you out of your goddamn mind?" "He's just a baby," Ezra said, moving to stand between Morrison and the crib. "He was dying." "They killed the Morrison family," Jake Morrison shouted, his face flushed with anger. "They burned out half the settlers in the valley, and you're playing nursemaid to one of their spawn." "Easy, Jake," Sheriff Brennan said, but his own hand rested on his gun butt. "Ezra, this is serious. How did this baby get here?" Ezra picked up the crying infant, and Little Wolf immediately quieted, his small fist gripping Ezra's shirt. "Don't know. Found him under the oak tree, wrapped in buffalo hide. Figured his people got caught in the storm. Maybe had to leave him behind." "Or it's a trap," Morrison said, his gun still drawn. "Comanche are cunning. They leave the baby, wait for some fool to take it in, then attack when his guard is down." "Look at him," Ezra said, holding the baby so they could see his face. "He's barely 4 months old. You think he's planning an attack?" Pete Crawford was shaking his head. "Ezra, you can't keep him. When word gets out, and it will get out, every settler in the territory will want your head. The territorial governor's got a standing order about Comanche prisoners." "He's not a prisoner," Ezra said quietly. "He's a child." Sheriff Brennan rubbed his jaw, clearly struggling with the situation. "Ezra, I understand your feelings, but Pete's right. This baby represents a threat to the entire settlement. His people will come looking for him." "Maybe," Ezra said. "Or maybe they think he's already dead." Morrison laughed bitterly. "You willing to bet your life on that? Because that's what you're doing. When they come, and they will come, they'll kill you and anyone else who gets in their way." The baby had fallen asleep in Ezra's arms, his breathing soft and regular. Looking down at the peaceful face, Ezra felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose, of responsibility for something beyond his own survival. "I'm not giving him up," he said finally. The 3 men exchanged glances. Morrison shook his head in disgust. "Then you're a dead man, Ezra, and you might just get the rest of us killed with you." As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Brennan turned back one more time. "Ezra, I can't protect you from this. When the Comanche come, you'll be on your own." "Understood," Ezra replied. After they rode away, Ezra stood in his doorway, watching them disappear into the white landscape. He knew they were right about one thing. Word would spread quickly through Cedar Ridge and beyond. By nightfall, every settler in the territory would know that silent Ezra McKenna was harboring a Comanche infant. The baby stirred in his arms, and Ezra looked down into those dark, trusting eyes. "Well, little wolf," he murmured, "looks like we're in this together now." In the distance, a hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing across the frozen plains like a warning. 2 weeks had passed since the sheriff's visit, and the baby had grown stronger under Ezra's careful tending. Little Wolf now smiled when he saw Ezra's weathered face, his tiny hands reaching for the cowboy's beard with curious fingers. Ezra had fashioned a proper cradle from oak planks, and each evening he would sit by the fire, watching the infant sleep, while the wind whispered secrets across the plains. But the peace was deceptive. Ezra had spotted riders on the distant ridges, dark silhouettes that appeared and vanished like ghosts. Sometimes they were white men from Cedar Ridge, keeping watch on his ranch with suspicious eyes. Other times, they were different shapes entirely, sitting motionless on painted ponies, observing from afar with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The Comanche had found him. On a clear morning, when the sun turned the snow-covered landscape into a field of diamonds, Ezra stepped outside to tend to his horses and froze. Smoke signals were rising from 3 different points on the horizon, thin, dark columns that spoke a language older than any words. He didn't need to understand Comanche to know what they meant. They knew about the baby, and they were coming. By midday, Ezra could see them clearly. They emerged from the tree line like spirits materializing from the earth itself. 20 warriors on horseback, their faces painted with symbols he didn't recognize, their weapons glinting in the winter sun. They formed a wide circle around his ranch, just out of rifle range, and settled in to wait. Ezra checked his weapons, his Winchester rifle, his Colt revolver, and the shotgun he kept by the door. He had enough ammunition for a fight, but not enough to win against 20 seasoned warriors. Still, he wasn't about to surrender without making them pay for it. The baby was fussing in his cradle, sensing perhaps the tension that filled the cabin like smoke. Ezra picked him up, bouncing him gently as he peered through the window at the circle of warriors. "Your people have come for you, little wolf," he murmured. "Question is, what do they intend to do with me?" As if summoned by his words, one of the warriors broke from the circle and rode slowly toward the cabin. He was older than the others, his long hair streaked with silver, his face marked by scars that spoke of many battles. He wore a magnificent war bonnet with eagle feathers that fluttered in the cold breeze, and his horse was painted with symbols that Ezra recognized as marks of high rank. The warrior stopped 50 yards from the cabin and sat motionless for several minutes, his dark eyes fixed on the door. Then he called out in accented but clear English, "White man, you have something that belongs to my people." Ezra stepped outside, the baby in his arms, his rifle within easy reach. The sight of the infant caused a visible reaction among the warriors. Several sat straighter in their saddles, and he heard what sounded like exclamations in their native tongue. "You are Chief Running Bear," Ezra said, somehow knowing it was true. He'd heard stories of the Comanche war chief, descriptions of his bearing and the legendary war bonnet he wore. The chief nodded slowly. "You know me, Silent One. I know you as well. The white eyes call you a man of few words, but your actions speak louder than the wind." He gestured toward the baby. "That child is my grandson, son of my daughter Standing Elk. She died bringing him into this world during the Great Storm." Ezra felt the pieces falling into place. The desperate flight through the blizzard, the abandoned baby, the timing of it all. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said simply. Running Bear's expression didn't change. "My war party was returning from a raid when the storm struck. We took shelter in a canyon, but Standing Elk, as she could not wait. When the storm broke, we found her body, but the child was gone. We followed the signs and found where you discovered him." "He was nearly dead," Ezra said. "Another hour and the cold would have taken him." "Yes," the chief acknowledged. "You saved his life when we could not. This brings honor to your name, Silent One, but it also brings complication." The other warriors had tightened their circle, and Ezra could see more riders approaching from the west, at least a dozen more, all armed and painted for war. His throat went dry as he realized the true size of the force arrayed against him. "My warriors say I should kill you and take the child," Running Bear continued. "They say you are like all white eyes. You take what is not yours and claim it by right of possession. They remember the burned villages, the broken promises, the children taken by your soldiers and sent to schools that steal their spirits. But I don't take children," Ezra said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. I saved them. Running Bear studied him for a long moment. This is why I come to speak instead of simply taking what is mine. Your actions show respect for life, even the life of an enemy's child. This is not common among your people. The baby had grown restless and was beginning to cry. Without thinking, Ezra began to rock him gently, and Little Wolf quieted, his small fist gripping the cowboy's shirt. The gesture was not lost on the watching warriors, and Ezra heard murmurs ripple through their ranks. He knows you, Running Bear observed. Already he sees you as protector. This too brings complication. What do you want from me? Ezra asked. The chief was silent for a long time, his eyes moving between Ezra and the baby. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of difficult decision. I want my grandson to live and grow strong. I want him to know the ways of his people, to carry the blood of warriors in his veins. But I also want him to understand the world that is coming, the world where Comanche and White Eyes must find new ways to survive. Running Bear raised his hand, and the circle of warriors tightened noticeably. Ezra's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but the chief shook his head. Tonight, we make camp around your ranch. Tomorrow, we decide the fate of both the child and the man who saved him. Sleep well, Silent One. Tomorrow's sun will bring either death or a new understanding between our peoples. As the warriors began to make camp in the gathering dusk, Ezra retreated to his cabin, the baby still in his arms. He barred the door and checked his weapons one final time, knowing that sleep would not come easily this night. Outside, the glow of Comanche campfires ringed his property like fallen stars, and in their light he could see painted faces watching his windows with eyes that held both gratitude and the promise of violence. Dawn came gray and cold, with a wind that carried the scent of wood smoke from the Comanche campfires. Ezra had spent the night in restless vigilance, dozing fitfully in his chair with the rifle across his knees and the baby sleeping peacefully in his cradle. Little Wolf seemed oblivious to the danger surrounding them, gurgling contentedly when Ezra fed him warm milk as the first light crept through the cabin windows. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Ezra's blood run cold, but these riders were coming from the east, from the direction of Cedar Ridge. Through his window, he could see Sheriff Brennan leading a group of 12 armed men, their faces grim with purpose. Behind them rode Deputy Morrison, Pete Crawford, and several ranchers Ezra recognized from town. Christ, Ezra muttered, realizing the true scope of what was about to unfold. He was caught between two armed forces, each convinced they were in the right, each prepared to use violence to achieve their goals. Chief Running Bear had seen them too. The Comanche leader rode out to meet the approaching settlers, his warriors forming a loose line behind him. The two groups faced each other across the snow-covered ground of Ezra's ranch, their weapons ready, their horses stamping and snorting in the cold air. "Running Bear," Sheriff Brennan called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "I'm here to retrieve a stolen child and arrest a man who's harboring Comanche property." The chief's laughter was like the sound of breaking ice. "Stolen child? The white man saves my grandson's life and you call this stealing? That baby belongs with his own people," Deputy Morrison shouted, his rifle already in his hands. "And McKenna broke territorial law by giving aid to hostiles." "Hostiles?" Running Bear's voice turned dangerous. "We defend our land from invaders, and we are called hostile. You burn our villages and steal our children for your schools, and you call this civilization." Ezra knew he had to act before the situation exploded into violence. Taking the baby in his arms, he stepped outside into the bitter morning air. The sight of him caused both groups to fall silent, their attention focused on the weathered cowboy and the infant he carried. "This stops here," Ezra said, his voice carrying with surprising authority. "I won't have this child's life decided by gunfire." Sheriff Brennan dismounted and walked toward him, his hand resting on his pistol. "Ezra, step away from that baby. You're coming back to town to stand trial for treason against the territorial government." "And the child comes with his people," Running Bear added, sliding down from his painted horse. "He belongs with the Comanche." Ezra looked down at Little Wolf, who was watching the proceedings with wide, curious eyes. The baby's tiny hand was wrapped around Ezra's finger, holding on with the complete trust that only the very young possess. In that moment, Ezra realized that neither group truly understood what was at stake. "You're both wrong," he said quietly, but his words carried in the still air. "This baby doesn't belong to anyone. He's not property to be claimed or evidence to be seized. He's a human being who deserves the chance to grow up in a world that doesn't tear itself apart over the color of his skin." Morrison laughed harshly. Pretty words, McKenna, but that savage will grow up to raid and kill just like his people. And if he grows up among your people, Running Bear responded coldly, he will forget the ways of his ancestors and become a stranger to his own blood. Ezra felt the weight of their expectations, their fears, their centuries of hatred pressing down on him like a physical force. But as he looked at the baby in his arms, he saw something that neither the Comanche nor the settlers seemed to understand. Innocence that transcended the bitter divisions of their adult world. "I have a proposition," Ezra said suddenly. Both groups fell silent, waiting. "Chief Running Bear, you said yesterday that your grandson needs to understand both worlds, his people's ways and the world that's coming. Sheriff, you're worried about protecting the settlement from future raids." He paused, gathering his thoughts. What if there was a way to honor both concerns? Running Bear's eyes narrowed. "Speak your words, Silent One." "I keep the boy for 1 year," Ezra said. "During that time, Running Bear, you teach him the language and stories of his people. I'll learn them too so I can pass them on. And Sheriff, during that same year, we establish a trading post here, neutral ground where Comanche and settlers can meet peacefully to exchange goods." The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison was shaking his head in disgust, while several of the Comanche warriors were speaking rapidly to their chief in their native tongue. "You're talking about making peace with savages," Pete Crawford spat. "After everything they've done to us?" "After everything we've done to each other," Ezra corrected. "This child could be a bridge between our peoples, or he could be another reason for war. The choice is ours." Running Bear studied Ezra for a long moment. "And at the end of this year? What then?" "Then the boy chooses," Ezra said simply. "When he's old enough to understand, he decides where he belongs. But he'll know both worlds, and maybe, just maybe, he can help build something better than what we have now." Sheriff Brennan shook his head. "The territorial government will never approve of this. Trading with hostiles is against federal law." "The territorial government is 300 miles away," Ezra replied. "What they don't know won't hurt them. And if this works, if we can find a way to coexist, then maybe fewer people will die on both sides." The baby began to fuss, and Ezra bounced him gently. Little Wolf settled immediately, his dark eyes fixed on Ezra's face with complete trust. The gesture was not lost on either group. Running Bear stepped closer, his weathered hand reaching out to touch his grandson's cheek. The baby's fingers immediately wrapped around the chief's thumb, and for a moment, the fierce war leader's expression softened. "You would raise him with honor?" Running Bear asked quietly. "With all the honor I possess," Ezra replied. "And you would truly learn our ways?" "I would." The chief looked at his warriors, then at the assembled settlers, then back at his grandson. "This is a dangerous path, Silent One. There are those among my people who would see this as weakness, as surrender to the white man's will. And there are those among mine who would see it as betrayal," Ezra acknowledged. "But sometimes the dangerous path is the only one worth walking." Running Bear was quiet for a long time, his hand still touching his grandson's face. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of momentous decision. "We will try this thing. But know this, Silent One. If harm comes to my grandson, if you break faith with this agreement, there will be no mercy. The Comanche do not forget betrayal." Sheriff Brennan was shaking his head. "I can't be party to this, Ezra. I have my duty to the law." "Then arrest me," Ezra said calmly. "But the baby stays here under Chief Running Bear's protection until you do." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Then, slowly, Sheriff Brennan holstered his weapon. "God help us all," he muttered. "But maybe you're right. Maybe it's time to try something different." As the two groups began to disperse, each returning to their respective camps to consider this unprecedented agreement, Ezra remained standing in his doorway, the baby in his arms, feeling the weight of history, settling on his shoulders like snow. 6 months had passed since the tense standoff at Ezra's ranch, and the landscape had transformed from winter white to the golden green of late spring. The trading post that had been little more than a desperate proposal was now a reality. A sturdy log building constructed on the boundary between Ezra's property and the traditional Comanche hunting grounds, where two peoples cautiously began to rebuild trust, one transaction at a time. Ezra stood in the doorway of the trading post, watching Chief Running Bear teaching his grandson the first words of Comanche. Little Wolf, now nearly 10 months old, was sitting upright and reaching for the colorful beads his grandfather dangled before him. The baby's first word had been Papa, directed at Ezra, but his second had been Ata, the Comanche word for father, spoken to Running Bear. "He grows strong," Running Bear said, lifting the baby into his arms. Already he shows the spirit of a warrior. Ezra nodded, watching the easy interaction between grandfather and grandson. The arrangement had not been without its challenges. There had been settlers who refused to trade with Indian sympathizers, and Comanche warriors who saw the peace as weakness. But gradually, practical necessity had begun to overcome prejudice on both sides. Mrs. Henderson from Cedar Ridge had been the first to bring her sick child to the trading post, desperate for the medicinal herbs that only the Comanche knew how to prepare. Young Tom Morrison, Deputy Morrison's nephew, had traded his grandfather's cavalry sword for a Comanche pony, claiming it was the finest horse he'd ever ridden. Slowly, carefully, bridges were being built. "The Council of Elders meets tomorrow," Running Bear said, his expression growing serious. "They will decide whether to honor our agreement for the remaining months or to demand the return of my grandson immediately." Ezra had been expecting this. The arrangement had always been fragile, dependent on the goodwill of leaders who faced pressure from their own people. "What will you tell them?" "The truth," Running Bear replied. "That this child thrives in both worlds, that he knows the songs of his people and the ways of the white man, that perhaps there is wisdom in walking between two paths." As if summoned by their conversation, Sheriff Brennan rode up to the trading post, his horse lathered from hard travel. His expression was grim as he dismounted. "Ezra, we have a problem," he said without preamble. "Territorial Inspector Williams is coming from Austin. He's heard about the trading post, about the arrangement. He'll be here within the week." Ezra felt his stomach drop. Inspector Williams was notorious for his rigid enforcement of federal Indian policy and his particular hatred of what he called savage sympathizers. "What's he planning?" Ezra asked. "Best case? He shuts down the trading post and takes you back to Austin for trial. Worst case?" Brennan glanced at little Wolf, who was now gurgling happily in his grandfather's arms. "He classifies the baby as a prisoner of war and ships him off to one of those government schools." Running Bear's face had gone stone cold. "No white man's school will touch my grandson. This I promise you." "Then we have a war," Brennan said simply, "because Williams has a company of cavalry riding with him, 30 men, all armed and ready for trouble." The three men stood in heavy silence, each understanding the implications. The fragile peace they had built over 6 months was about to be shattered by the arrival of a federal official who saw only enemies and allies, with no room for the gray areas where hope might grow. "There is another way," Ezra said quietly. Both men turned to him. "Running Bear, your people know this land better than any cavalry unit. They could disappear into the wilderness and never be found. And abandon the trading post? Abandon the progress we have made?" The chief shook his head. "No. If we run now, we prove to your people that we are nothing but savages who cannot honor agreements." "Then we make a stand," Ezra said. "All of us, together." Sheriff Brennan looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. "Against federal authority? Ezra, that's treason. Is it treason to protect a child? To defend an agreement that's brought peace to this valley for the first time in years?" Ezra gestured toward the trading post, where a Comanche woman was teaching a settler's daughter how to weave baskets. "Look around you, Tom. This is working. People are talking instead of shooting. Children are playing together instead of hiding in fear." As if to emphasize his point, little Wolf began to babble, his hands reaching for both men. The baby had learned to recognize them as protectors, as family, regardless of the color of their skin or the uniforms they wore. "The boy has chosen," Running Bear said suddenly, "not with words, but with his heart. He sees no difference between us. Perhaps this is the wisdom we need." Over the next 3 days, word spread through both communities about the approaching inspector. The reaction was not what anyone had expected. Settlers who had initially opposed the trading post now spoke of its benefits: the steady supply of buffalo hides, the medicinal herbs that had saved their children, the absence of raids that had plagued the valley for years. Comanche warriors who had once called for Running Bear's removal now saw the value in having a secure place to trade for metal tools and blankets. When Inspector Williams arrived with his cavalry escort, he found something unprecedented: a united front of settlers and Comanche standing together at the trading post. Men who had been enemies 6 months earlier now stood shoulder to shoulder, their children playing together in the dust, while their wives shared recipes and stories. Williams was a thin, officious man with the pale complexion of someone who spent his time behind a desk rather than in the saddle. He surveyed the scene with undisguised disgust. "This is an abomination," he declared, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Fraternizing with hostiles is a federal crime. Sheriff Brennan, arrest these people immediately. Which people? Brennan asked calmly. The ones trading legally, or the ones trying to build a better life for their children? William's face turned red. Don't play games with me, Sheriff. I know about the Comanche baby. Where is he? Ezra stepped forward, Little Wolf in his arms. The baby had grown strong and healthy, his dark eyes bright with intelligence as he looked curiously at the newcomer. This is Little Wolf, Ezra said. He's not a prisoner or a trophy. He's a child who's learning to live in both worlds. That savage belongs in a government school, William snapped, where he can be properly civilized. The reaction was immediate. Comanche warriors reached for their weapons, while settlers moved to shield their own children. The careful peace that had taken months to build was seconds away from exploding into violence. But it was Little Wolf himself who changed everything. The baby, perhaps sensing the tension, began to cry. Without thinking, both Ezra and Running Bear reached for him at the same time. Their hands met on the child's back, and in that moment, everyone present could see the truth. This child belonged to both worlds, and both worlds belonged to him. Inspector Williams, Sheriff Brennan said quietly, I think you need to see what we've built here before you tear it down. What followed was the most unusual diplomatic meeting in the history of the Texas frontier. Williams, faced with the evidence of successful cooperation between two peoples who had been at war for generations, found himself in an impossible position. The trading post was clearly legal under territorial law, the Comanche were honoring their agreements, and the child was thriving. In the end, it was Little Wolf who sealed the deal. As Williams held the baby awkwardly, trying to maintain his official demeanor, Little Wolf grabbed the inspector's nose and laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed across the valley like a promise of better days to come. 1 year, Williams said finally, his voice hoarse. I'll give you 1 year to prove this experiment can work, but if there's any trouble, any violence, any violation of federal law, I'll be back with enough men to end this permanently. As the cavalry rode away, leaving behind a valley that had learned to choose hope over hatred, Ezra sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Little Wolf was asleep in his arms, and Running Bear sat beside them, sharing stories of the old days when the world was simpler, but not necessarily better. You think it will work? Running Bear asked quietly. Ezra looked out at the trading post, where lamplight glowed in the windows and the sound of laughter drifted on the evening breeze. I think we've already proven it can work. The question is whether we're brave enough to keep choosing it every single day. Little Wolf stirred in his arms and Ezra smiled. The baby would grow up in a world where Comanche and settlers could sit together on a porch, sharing stories and watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. It wasn't the world either of them had been born into, but it was the world they had chosen to build together. And that, Ezra thought, was worth all the risks they had taken to get here.